Another objection that is raised to the Gospels is that Jesus' disciples were somehow too biased or too gullible to be trusted because they recorded that Jesus did miracles and predicted the future and raised himself from the dead. One response would be to ask, are any historians truly unbiased? Every historian has biases. If we didn't have any other way to check their story, would Matthew or Luke be any more biased than other historians such as Herodotus, Thucydides, Josephus, or Tacitus? This brings up the unspoken objection behind this unspoken assumption, which is that it's not just a matter of political biases, but the question of naturalism. If we supposedly know that miracles are impossible, then any historian who cites miracles must automatically be more biased and gullible and untrustworthy, regardless of whether his history seems to be corroborated in other ways. So we would naturally ask, how do we know that miracles are impossible? Could that attitude itself be a naturalistic or anti-supernatural bias? Philosopher David Hume tried to answer this by saying that there's uniform experience that miracles do not happen and have never happened. But as C.S. Lewis pointed out, unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them to be false. And we can know all the reports of them to be false only if we already know that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. I think C.S. Lewis is right on this. One good response, if you encounter this sort of attitude from your friends, would be to ask a question like, are you open to the possibility that miracles might have occurred? Or are you so sure that miracles are impossible that no evidence would be sufficient? And then you can see how they answer and discuss either way they answer that. It turns out that a key question is whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. If he did rise from the dead, then the other miracle stories are much more likely to be true. Some people claim that Jesus was just a religious teacher, and after he died, his followers loved him so much that they told exaggerated stories over the years about his good works, and over the decades the stories grew and grew until eventually people started to claim that he had come back from the dead. But this theory doesn't work because the disciples were preaching so early in Judea about Jesus being raised from the dead within weeks of the event, according to Acts, and certainly within the first 15 years, as corroborated by many historical sources, both Christian and non-Christian. This is too early to be a gradual mythologizing or a legendizing process, which would take many decades. Also, the Jews were not expecting anyone to rise from the dead to an immortal body before the end of the world, and were not expecting a Messiah who would die and rise again. So this would be very strange to them. There was some discussion back then of maybe two Messiahs, Messiah son of Joseph who would suffer, as Isaiah 53 said, and Messiah son of David who would conquer the Romans and bring Israel back to peace and prosperity, as many other prophecies said. But the idea of a physically resurrected Messiah was very strange and unpopular among the Jews at that time. There were several other failed Messiahs around that time, such as Judas of Galilee, Theudas, Simon of Perea, and later Simon Bar Kokhba. No one made up legends about those guys coming back to life. If Jesus had not risen from the dead, he would have just been another in a long list of failed messiahs. Likewise, the Greeks and Romans did not expect any physical bodily resurrection. In fact, from Greek philosophy, that idea would have been disgusting in their view. They saw spirit as good and physical bodies as evil. So the disciples' preaching of Jesus' resurrection would be contrary to the worldview and expectations of the people at that time. So it would not have been the type of thing that they would have gradually added to the stories of Jesus to make him more popular. Those types of stories would make him less popular. Also, crucifixion was such a shameful way to die at that time. Only the lowest criminals or traitors were killed that way. And it would have been embarrassing to both Jews and Romans to try to persuade people to follow a crucified man if he had not actually been crucified. The only reason they wrote about Jesus' death by crucifixion is that that's the way it really happened. An important early resurrection account is firmly dated to before 51 AD. That's Paul's summary of the gospel in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7. This is viewed by scholars to come from his earlier visits with the apostles in Jerusalem. The letter of 1 Corinthians was written around 55 AD, and this section refers back to when Paul first visited the Corinthians around 50 AD and had delivered this summary of the gospel to them. Paul's visit to Corinth is firmly dated to around 50 to 51 AD because of Gallio, whom we'll talk about later. So here is the actual summary. Now, some scholars think that this section is based on an early creed from the Jerusalem church, so not just teachings in general, but a specific formalized, memorized creed, because of the structure of starting many phrases with "and," fits more of an Aramaic style, and the Greek words for delivered and received that Paul used were terms used by rabbis at that time to talk about how a student would receive some teaching and then carefully deliver the same teaching to others. Here's the part that scholars think might be a creed. If Jesus died in 33 AD and Paul delivered this gospel summary to the Corinthians around 50 or 51 AD, he would have learned it from the Jerusalem disciples within 15 years at most, possibly as early as 3 years after Jesus. See the supplement for more details about this. Also, notice that Paul said the Christian faith is completely dependent on Jesus' resurrection. Here's what he says: if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain. Your faith also is vain. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. I'm quoting here from a couple verses from 1 Corinthians 15. If we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. But now, Christ has been raised from the dead, and he goes on to talk about the implications of that. Here are some reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. First, the tomb was found empty on the third day. Most historians agree on this, because if Jesus' body had still been in the tomb, the Pharisees or other authorities could easily have stopped Christianity simply by showing the dead body of Jesus. Also, the fact that all the Gospels report that women were the first people to find the tomb empty would not be the sort of story they would have invented if they were trying to make a convincing story about Jesus' resurrection, because the testimony of women at that time was considered so unreliable that it was not allowed in court in that part of the world unless there were no male witnesses available. You can read the supplement for details. They recorded that women were the first ones to find the empty tomb because that's the way it actually happened. This principle is called the principle of embarrassment, and it originally came from textual criticism scholars. The idea is that if a story is embarrassing to the original authors, but they still decide to include it, it's more likely to be true. Other embarrassing aspects were that the disciples were portrayed in the Gospels as constantly misunderstanding Jesus, and most of them ran away from him during his last night and day. Rather embarrassing things to report if it was not true. And of course, his crucifixion itself would be super embarrassing if that was not accurate. So everybody agrees that Jesus was crucified. The second reason is that all of Jesus' closest disciples believed that they had seen Jesus alive again after he died. As atheist scholar Bart Ehrman says, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. Now, think about this. Could these people have just been hallucinating? That's another theory that's often brought up. That'd be a very strange hallucination that affected dozens of other people, and in one case more than 500 people, over a 40-day period. These appearances were not only visual, but they talked with him, touched his wounded hands and feet and side, and shared a meal with him several times. So it's multisensory. Could the disciples have all been lying? Of course it's possible. But we have to ask what they would gain. They faced heavy persecution afterward, both from Jewish leaders and later from the Romans. Some of them were executed, some were jailed, beaten, kicked out of their synagogues and social groups. I'm sure some of them probably lost their jobs. Why would people keep lying if it only brought them trouble? It makes more sense that they must have been telling the truth. Some people were have questioned whether they did really die as martyrs or whether these were just later legends about the apostles. It's true that we do not have strong historical evidence for how all of Jesus' 12 disciples died, his 12 apostles, but the case for the martyrdom of Peter and Paul and James is very strong. And regarding the others, there is strong evidence that they all lived through times of persecution and hardship for their faith, where they knew that they could be killed for what they were preaching, because some disciples had been killed. Regarding this question of bias, it's also interesting to compare the New Testament accounts about Jesus' resurrection with miracle stories about other people like Apollonius of Tyana, a Greek philosopher living in Cappadocia around the same time as Jesus. There's some stories that Apollonius healed people, and one time he had special instantaneous knowledge about an event that occurred 1,000 miles away. However, the earliest source we have for these stories was one biography, written more than 120 years after his life by another Greek philosopher who was commissioned to write his biography by the empress, the wife of the Roman emperor. So there we have a situation where the author was being paid by the queen to write a glowing biography. So in terms of bias, he would obviously be rewarded and have better job security the more miracle stories he could find 120 years after the fact, where there were no eyewitnesses around to say otherwise. By contrast, when the dozens of Jesus' disciples proclaimed that they had seen Jesus alive after he had died, Jesus who had just been executed as a criminal, any bias for personal gain or self-preservation would be pushing them the other way to keep quiet, and the easiest path would be against those making those claims that Jesus had risen and was indeed the Messiah. Finally, similarly to the other disciples, something drastic must have happened to have changed Paul from a man who was running around putting Christians in jail to suddenly becoming a Christian himself after claiming to have seen Jesus alive on the road to Damascus. Also James, Jesus' younger brother, who earlier in his life was not believing in Jesus' claims, after he saw Jesus resurrected, he believed in Jesus. So something must have changed those, you could say, hostile witnesses to believe in Jesus, and in particular to believe that he had arisen, that he was alive after he had died. So getting back to the question of how we check the bias of sources, are we just using circular reasoning if we say that Jesus' resurrection makes it easier to take the rest of the Gospels as historically accurate, including the miracle stories, since we're using the Gospels as the main source for the resurrection accounts? No, it's not circular, because we can support the trustworthiness of the Gospels and other New Testament books in other ways too, such as checking them against external non-Christian sources and archaeology, even against each other, since there are some differences between them, indicating some level of independence. These are ways to check bias, because it's true that all historians have bias, but if an account is trustworthy where we can test it against other sources, we can assume it's also trustworthy at other points. And again, this is a sliding scale, so the more we can confirm it and corroborate it with other places, the stronger the confidence we have. If the New Testament gets dates, names, locations, customs correct in what we know from other sources, it's more likely to be trustworthy in other areas where we cannot check it. And this is the same process we do with any other ancient historian to check their accuracy.